I'd like to pass the virtual baton to Mark now, who has some thoughts from his work in the field.
Thank you, Hilda, and hello to all of you out there in Zoom land. I'm coming to you from my home office in Houston, Texas, where we are still recovering from Hurricane Beryl glancing across us this past couple of days. I was just able to get my internet access back early this morning, just in time to come in and chat with you today. As Ruth said, I'm one of the NFC moderators. My pro gig is research on various aspects of nonprofit organizations and the nonprofit sector. I left my tenured faculty position 2 years ago to focus on research and things I really want to do, like work with the nonprofit financial commons. Nonprofit finance has been I just say a periodic focus of mine because I'm interested in lots of things related to the operation of nonprofit organizations. But as I was preparing my thoughts for this today, I recalled one particular moment in the spring of 2000. I can actually remember the desk I was sitting at the time. I was reading and doing a critical review of an article by colleagues that had introduced me to the idea that diversification or concentration of revenue types might influence the fates of nonprofits. Now, I already knew about revenue streams and where do you get your money from. That's something I'd been paying some attention to, but this idea of diversification or concentration, how much of what kinds of revenue streams do you have? What combinations do you have was new to me. And that's the topic that we're trying to delve into a little bit more in our webinar today. That idea back then in the spring of 2000 just kind of hit me between the eyes, and I immediately incorporated the idea of revenue diversification into an analysis I was doing at the time of the financial vulnerability of nonprofit arts organizations. And that's an old paper nobody wants to read, but if I'm going to refer to some things, I can at least drop some things into the chat here as I do it. So there's a link dropped into the chat. But after I'd written that, my attention turned again. I continued to look at finance, but my attention turned to the study of cost allocations at the time. And I generally lost track of the thread on revenue diversification for a number of years. You can fast forward, geez, more than a decade, maybe more like 15 years, when a young colleague approached me and said, hey, while you weren't paying attention to this, a lot of researchers have been publishing research on the influence of revenue diversification on various aspects of nonprofit management or nonprofit behavior. He told me they were doing with the diversity of approaches and they were arriving at a variety of conflicting results. And he suggested that this was a rabbit hole that he and I could go down together. And so we started doing that. Tell to go to slide 2 here, and you'll see that we did was something called a meta-analysis, which you can sort of think of as a study of studies. This project allowed me to dig back into the topic of revenue diversification. In this project, we located 40 different studies that reported statistical relationships between some measure of revenue stream diversification and something that could be framed as financial health. I'll drop that link in here as well. The important thing to take away from that paper was just sort of a summary statistic that got us going on this project. The tables that we report in that study showed we went through these 40 papers and we pulled out the 296 statistical tests that are reported in those 40 papers that look at the relationship between revenue stream diversification or concentration and some dimension of financial health. And we found in 142 of those cases, there was a positive relationship, meaning having a diversified revenue stream was a good thing for the financial health of the organization. In 31 cases, there was no relationship, and in 123, there was a negative relationship, meaning the more diversified your revenues, the poorer your financial health. So this gives us the basis to use these particular results for the analysis that you can get in that particular paper. I don't suggest anybody read it. We went to the Nonprofit Quarterly. Go to the next slide here, Hilda. And let's see, there's a link that I can do to that nonprofit quarterly article here, where we were less interested in reporting out the results on that article and more on summarizing the arguments that people make on why diversification or concentration of revenue streams might matter or might not matter, might be good, might be bad. And we can start out with these, you might call them pro arguments. And these are the ones you usually hear. The first one might even be called a textbook argument that you've likely heard before about why you, Mr. or Mrs. Nonprofit organization, ought to diversify your revenue streams. And that's because sooner or later, something's going to change. Could be a hurricane, could be that a donor just decides to give to somebody else. And the question is, what do you do when something big changes? If you only rely on one revenue stream and it disappears, then you're in trouble. If you have various streams, you can lean more on stream B or stream C when stream A goes through that period of uncertainty. There's also an argument about autonomy. This is the question of whether you have the freedom to pursue your own mission or if you're just vending the mission of others, carrying out the mission of others. In this case, autonomy is thought of as a good thing. If you're relying on a single source, and especially particular single sources, this can be pretty limiting for you. Government contracts in particular are notorious for robbing nonprofits of their own decision-making. And the argument is that if you added grants, or if you added individual gifts, or a social enterprise, that might give you more ability to call your own shots, mission-wise. A third argument people make is about exposure in the community, sometimes called the social capital argument. The idea is that the more community stakeholders know about you, the better. If all of your money comes from big foundation grants, then government agencies don't know about you. Individual mover donors in the community might not ever hear about you, and they never therefore get the opportunity to learn about you and maybe support you in some way. But developing more income streams means developing more audiences, which is exposure and social capital. So it's not surprising to hear these pro arguments out there. Be diversified, be diversified, be diversified. But Hilda, slide 4 here is con arguments. Like I said, when we look at these studies that people have done on this topic, they're often finding negative relationships between diversification and the financial health of organizations. But you hear less about these kinds of arguments out in the consultant sphere. There are downsides, or at least potential downsides to revenue diversification. One is that every revenue venture carries elements of risk. So adding revenue streams multiplies your exposure to risk, and risk is that thing that can increase your chances of failure. A second argument has to do with crowd out of donations. The argument here is that prospective donors evaluate what you're doing and make their giving decisions accordingly. So when you make a change, they might make a change. There's my timer. Let me turn it off. An example here, a favored donor who routinely gives an annual $20,000 gift, but then she reads in the newspaper that you've landed a $4 million government contract. Her reaction to that might be, well, they don't need my money. I'll give it to the opera this year instead. So your pursuit to that government contract might result in the crowding out of donations. A third issue here is increased administrative costs. There's going to be risks, and there are going to be administrative outputs and anything new that you create. And you have new processes, you might have new software, you might have new staff. That's going to create management issues that some people might not want to have, but there's also the danger of escalating non-program costs. And sadly, donors may take escalating administrative costs as inefficiencies that lead them to not donate or otherwise fund your work. Let me go quickly to the next slide here, Hilda. There's an article here that we'll refer to a few times today, recently published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review by our friends at the Bridgespan Group. When I read this article, my takeaway point was that they find the big organizations that they study tended to rely mostly on a single revenue stream. And so that argues strongly for concentration of revenues. There are 3 other takeaways that you'll hear about in the webinar today, and then I'll pass the torch to Hilda. One is they suggest you focus on concentration in one or two revenue categories. Don't go scattershot. You just open yourself up to some of those cons that we were talking about. Secondly, seek funding that's a natural match to your organization's work. And thirdly, get really good at making these work for you. You become more efficient, you'll be more effective in carrying out those particular revenue streams if you focus on the things that are good for you. Those are my remarks. Let me pass the torch back to Hilda here. I'll return in just a bit with her for some of your Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark.